Last August, the Gamergate hashtag exploded on Twitter, becoming the default name for an anonymous amorphous movement which was coordinated on Reddit, 4chan, and 8chan. It began as a response to a blog post of a jilted former boyfriend of game designer Zoe Quinn, and involved virulent, sustained campaigns of harassment against prominent women connected with the games industry, like Anita Sarkeesian, Brianna Wu, and Leigh Alexander. As these women and many others reported the harassment that they were receiving, they were met with a lot of skepticism and disbelief in the internet community. The authorities don't treat online harassment the same way they treat face-to-face harassment, and a lot of these threats went completely uninvestigated. The few threats that did receive any police attention didn't result in any conviction, and the online culture was totally dismissive. There were many tactics for dismissing the abuse. At one end of the spectrum were arguments that verbal harassment is just a part of the online community and it isn't that serious, that it's done as a jest or intentionally to try to get a rise out of the target, that it's a common and accepted tactic among certain gamer and forum subcultures. At the other end of the spectrum was outright denial. People either said that the abuse wasn't happening or that it was being exaggerated by the victims. I mean, they denied it in the face of thousands of documented instances. Or if they were forced to actually acknowledge its existence, they accused the victims of intentionally inciting it as a strategy to garner sympathy for themselves. In short, they called these women attention-seeking whores. They denied the reality of the harassment by heaping more harassment on the victims. The irony was completely lost on them. The Gospel writers notoriously disagree about a lot of details about the resurrection, but all four agree about one critical detail. It was the women who first learned that Jesus' body had disappeared from the tomb. And whether it was through an angel's testimony, or a young man running away, or an appearance by Jesus himself in the garden, it was the women, by tradition Mary Magdalene, who first learned that Jesus had been resurrected from the dead. By Jewish custom, women were not considered reliable witnesses. They were in a category with tax collectors, usurers, children, foreigners, and slaves of people who were not considered eligible to testify at trial. So when Jesus appears initially exclusively to women and asks them to testify to such an unbelievable reality as his apparent resurrection from the dead, it places our attention, our focus squarely on matters of credibility and trust. In fact, when they report back to the other disciples, initially they don't believe them. In John's Gospel, Peter and the beloved disciple have to go to investigate the tomb for themselves, to see with their own eyes that the body has gone missing. Even then, they don't believe. They walk away shaking their heads, not getting what's happening. Only Mary Magdalene has enough faithfulness to try to stay behind in the garden to understand what's happening. Mary Magdalene, who according to Luke and the longer ending of Mark, had 7 demons cast out from her. In other words, a woman who has been stigmatized as unclean or sick. A woman who, by her contemporaries, is probably regarded as even less trustworthy than most women. This woman is the only person to encounter the resurrected Jesus on Easter morning. While not a matter of law anymore, the tendency to dismiss the testimony of women as regards their own experience is still incredibly strong in our culture. It's most obvious and hurtful when it comes to instances of harassment and abuse. There are at least 35 women who have now publicly accused Bill Cosby of sexual abuse. Jay Leno isn't exactly a comedian known for telling truth to power, but even he got it right when he said, "I don't know why it's so hard to believe women. You go to Saudi Arabia, you need 2 women to testify against a man. Here you need 25. As Gamergate clearly shows, women who speak up about these experiences don't just face disbelief, they face fierce attacks on their character, their family, their profession, and even their lives. Is it any wonder that so many women choose, as the women at the end of Mark chose, to say nothing to anyone because they were afraid? And it's not only those trying to report crimes against them that are attacked. There are strains of toxic masculinity currently seeing a resurgence in certain subcultures which portray all women as inherently mendacious and manipulative. These men call themselves red pillars, men who believe against all evidence that the world is set up to unfairly benefit women and exploit men. Or they call themselves MGTOW, which is an acronym meaning men going their own way, which involves cutting off any personal deep relationships with women. Or some of these men are pickup artists who base their self-worth on their sexual conquests and use techniques like negging, which are intended to manipulate women into casual sex. From a certain perspective, outbursts like Gamergate and the deeply deceived ideology of the men's rights activists can be seen as a consequence of the successes of feminism. These are the expressions of the resentment of a shrinking portion of our population, but they should not be underestimated for this reason. Some of the most virulent and toxic ideas arise in such circumstances. Last year, a young man named Elliot Rodger murdered 6 people in Santa Barbara and left behind a manifesto full of the jargon of the manosphere and blaming women for refusing to have sex with him. But for Christians, the critical reason to oppose misogyny is not for fear of the worst actions of a few extremists, but because the beating heart of the gospel, the story of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, is a story about the exaltation of a victim. Jesus not only entrusts the good news of his new life to a woman, but to a woman who has been despised and outcast, a woman which Christian tradition tragically marginalized anew when it baselessly labeled her a prostitute. That woman, Mary Magdalene, is the first evangelist, the apostle, to the apostles. And the choice of Mary is not an accident, but an outgrowth of Christ's own choice to identify with the victimized of the world, to identify so closely that he became victim for our sake. To be a follower of Christ means to trust the word of the victim. As Christian men relate to women, our first duty is to listen to them when they relate their experiences of being harassed, abused, and ignored, and to believe them. All Christians should be feminist, which merely means a person who believes in the equality of women and men. Now, Gamergate would derisively call such a person a social justice warrior, which once again displays their total lack of comprehension of irony that they put themselves in opposition to social justice. I mean, wear that label with pride, because the biggest social justice warrior ever was a carpenter from Nazareth. After I wrote the script for this video, I watched this excellent video by Lacey Green in which she comments on the question of whether or not women falsely report rape. Spoiler alert, they don't, but you should totally click through and watch her excellent video. Oh, and despite what I said at the end of the video there, you don't have to be a social justice warrior if you don't want. You could be a social justice cleric, like me. You could be a social justice rogue, a social justice sorcerer. Really, you can pick whichever class best suits the ability scores that you rolled. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and see you next week. Jesus